Hi, it's Doug Wright, and thanks for joining me again for our series on comedy and politics. And I am especially delighted that today we have a remarkable individual joining us for a half hour of conversation. This is really focusing on only one aspect of his remarkable career. He has been a humorist and a comedian, most notably as a correspondent on The Daily Show, but he is also an author and an actor and a fan of the New York Theater Workshop. And most of us will also know him from Ayad Akhtar's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Disgraced. And of course, Ayad is a member of our workshop family. So with no further ado, I want to introduce you to Aasif Mandvi.
Hi.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. We're grateful to catch you on a day you're not shooting your TV series so that you can chat with us for half an hour.
Yeah. Well, I have, when I'm not shooting my show, I am taking care of my 8-month-old. So this is the only half hour I have during the time.
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, it's like between diapers and learning lines. Like I'm basically, I'm really, I'm filled up. My day is full.
Well, that makes us doubly grateful, and we'll try not to be selfish with you.
No, I'm excited to do this, and I'm glad to meet you. I'm a big fan of yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
I was very excited when you reached out, and then I checked to make sure it was actually Doug Wright, the playwright, and not Doug Wright, the guy who has a podcast. And last night I told my wife, I said, tomorrow I'm talking to Doug Wright, and she was like, I am my own wife, Doug Wright? And I said, yeah, I'm going to be chatting with him. She said, I love that place. It's one of my favorite plays of all time. And please tell him what a huge fan I am. And then a couple of minutes went by and she said, you sure you're talking to the playwright?
That's hilarious.
Is there another Doug Wright? And she had Googled and she was like, well, there's a Doug Wright that has a podcast series. And is he sure it's not? And then I was like, oh my God, what if I've made a terrible mistake? And then I went back to your original email. I was like, no, it's Doug Wright, the playwright.
That is hilarious. There's also a cartoonist in Canada named Doug Wright, because I'm always being told that, the Doug Wright Award just went to a new editorial cartoonist. But yeah.
So I didn't have the Doug Wright Award.
I know, totally. So we spoke a little bit before, Aasif, by email, and you know that I have this contention that in certainly the last 4 years, I feel like comedians have more credibility when discussing American politics than news commentators who've become so partisan. And this past year, the New York Times even started summarizing the comments made by the late night comics in a special section. So their prominence in the culture as communicators and purveyors of truth have become even greater now than they historically have been. First of all, do you agree? And secondly, why do you think that might be so?
Well, I mean, yes, I agree. And this is the idea that the court jester is the one who is telling the truth is not a new one. This goes back to Shakespeare and beyond. I think that the idea that the clown, the fool, the jester is the one who is speaking truth to power because everybody else has their own agendas and needs to be able to. I'll tell you a story if you have a minute. I'll tell you a story. When I was on The Daily Show, we sort of invaded a press conference given by Rick Scott, the then governor of Florida. And we wanted to ask him about, there was a whole story about people getting money, unemployment and benefits and things. And certain people were not getting it because they were worried that certain lower income people were using this for drugs, this money, and they were not. I'm probably not getting it completely right because it was many years ago now. But the idea was that they were asking people to take urine drug tests, And so our premise of the joke was we go into that room in the middle of his press conference with all of the state of Florida press there and ask him to take a urine test, because what we realized was he also gets paid by the Florida taxpayer. The argument was that this is the Florida taxpayers' money. They should know where it goes. So therefore, the people getting these benefits should take a drug test. We said, well, where do you get paid? Well, you get paid by the Florida taxpayer as well. So you should also take a drug test to make sure that you're not using the money for nefarious purposes. And of course, asking him to take a drug test in the middle of this. Now, what I realized was we got into that room and I was able to like have this moment where I basically spoke this truth in the middle of, and there was every press outlet in the state of Florida was there. And when we got done, it was silent, by the way, in the room. When we got done, we walked out, all the journalists from the Tampa Tribune and the Miami Herald and on and on, they all came running up to us and they said, we wish we could say that.
Wow.
We wish we could say that. That was so great that you called him out on that. We wish we could say that. But the reason they couldn't is because they have to get back in that room again. And they have to be invited back. And so that is often why I think the clown or the fool or the jester or the comedian is able to say things, because he or she isn't beholden to that system that has its own rules and protocols, That's
amazing.
Yeah.
So your outsider status becomes an advantage. You don't have to curry favor in the same way.
Yeah. And you're also not looking, one of the things I realized when I was on the Daily Show for years was that we would put the lens in a place that the regular media wouldn't put it, because we were looking, our ultimate aim was to entertain and make people laugh. And in doing that, we were able to sometimes enter the story through the window as opposed to the front door where everyone else was going, because we were looking for a different angle. And often that was illuminating in a way that just asking the same old questions that every journalist would ask was just going down the same road. So I think that's also part of it.
That makes sense. And let me ask you, as someone who is trained in the theater and an accomplished actor, how was it that the Daily Show came to call on you for an audition? Because you weren't out there, doing stand-up or working as a journalist. What made them say this actor is someone that we should consider?
It's a remarkable thing that I actually ended up there, and it's all due to Jon Stewart. They had an audition. Sometimes in this business, as you know, you're just the planets align, and you just happen to be standing at the spot where the thing that needs to be said or done or what they need is exactly what you happen to bring. And so it doesn't always happen, but it happens sometimes. And this was one of those instances where they needed a Middle Eastern journalist for a story that they had written that they realized they had no one on staff for. So they had written this wonderful piece. It was a correspondent piece about the Hezbollah, the Lebanese Hezbollah war that was going on. This is 2006, and they'd written this really provocative, smart piece of comedy / journalism. And then they said, well, we need a correspondent who is in the Middle East reporting on this, an actual Middle Eastern so we don't have someone. So they said, well, let's just get someone to come in for a day and have them be like a one-day gig. And so there was an audition, and my manager called and said, do you want to go to this audition? And I remember like not really wanting to go initially, because I thought this was going to be some nonsense sketch where I'd done these late night talk show things where I'd sort of been asked to like put a turban on and pretend like I'm flying around on a magic carpet or something. So I was like, if this is something like that, I'm not in the mood and I'm not up for it. And they called back and they said, no, it's actually for a correspondent piece that they've written. So I thought, okay. So when I went down there and auditioned, it was one of those moments where this was not on my radar, like I was doing Broadway and theater and movies and TV, I was like, Daily Show would seem beneath me, honestly, to be snobbish about it. And I remember like the girl came out and she said, she gave me the sides and the stuff and I was looking it over and she came out and she said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "I need a few more minutes because there's a lot of material." And she said, "Oh, it's all on the teleprompter. You don't need to memorize it." And I thought, teleprompter? I was like, no, this is gonna be, this is child's play. And so with this incredibly like, I remember John said to me, "Have you ever performed in front of a live audience before?" And I was so insulted. I said, "I've been on Broadway." And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know I was Mr. Broadway. Okay, and then we did it, and we did the piece, and I really just did my best Stephen Colbert impression, to be quite honest.
Wow.
And I thought, well, I'll, and I didn't, and I was like, if I don't get it, fine. It's, it's a day's work that I didn't get, and if I do, great. Well, I got it, and I got it right there, and he hired me on the spot and said, "You're going to be on the show tonight. Are you okay with that?" And I said, "Sure," and like I canceled my dinner plans, and I was on the show, but initially it was done as just a one-off, and then he just really liked me, and I think he wanted someone who was not of the mold that they normally hired. I think he didn't want someone who came from improv or stand up or just, which is kind of what I think he wanted somebody who was an actor actually, and I think I brought that, and he saw that. He saw, oh, this guy's an actor. This guy's not just a stand-up comic, and he liked that. And I think he wanted to have more of that on the show, and so he kept calling me back to do pieces. And then there was a period of about 4 months where I just kept coming back and doing a piece every week or so, a couple of weeks, and then about 4 months later, he said, "I'd like to offer you a permanent position here and a contract and all that good stuff." So that's really how it happened. And it was completely not what I expected to be doing. It wasn't on my radar at all, but one of the greatest jobs I ever had, and one of the a job where I learned so much about, and shaped a great deal of my my comedic identity, as it were, at least, yeah.
And had you all, because clearly to thrive in that job as you did, a prerequisite for success was a keen interest in politics. Was that something that you'd always had?
No. I mean, that's so interesting. Is it like I was as political as the next person, I guess, but not in any greater sense than anybody else. And I think what happened to me was that I initially got on the Daily Show and thought, well, I had tremendous imposter syndrome where I was like, well, these guys are going to figure out that I shouldn't be here. This is not the world that I should be in. And then very quickly, and maybe, I sometimes attribute this to my immigrant background, which is that as an immigrant, sometimes you go, okay, how do I figure this out? I'd never been in a musical before when I was in Oklahoma, and I'd never done that. I didn't think I was going to do that either. So I think that I start to figure out like, okay, what is the thing I need to learn here and how do I get better at it? And I realized that like also there was an opportunity here to say something in a way that I had never been given before, and to say something about the culture, because this was 2006, 2007. We were in Iraq. Bush was the president. It was a time of tremendous Islamophobia, not that now isn't, but at that time, it was soon after 9/11. And the idea of a brown person and a Muslim person talking on television about these things I suddenly started to find a voice around that. And it took about a year or so, and they had enough faith in me, I guess, but I knew the comedy part because I'd done comedy. And I knew how to do that. I knew how to like have them write something for me and for me to make it funny. I could do that. That's acting. I'd done that my whole career. But then I started pitching stories, and then I started like coming up with ideas of my own and sort of finding that thing that I hadn't done before. And that was a muscle. And to be fair, I got to work. It wasn't me alone. I got to work with tremendous writers who supported those ideas and sort of gave and sort of took my starting point and went, oh, okay, this is what we can do. And then you'd sit down and you'd bounce it off of people and go, everything at the Daily Show was created in a, with 6 people or 10 people. It wasn't the one, you didn't have to come in with a fully formed idea, but it was a collaborative thing. And so I realized like, oh, this is something I can do, and actually started to feel excited about and felt like, and I had improv training in school, and right out of college, I was in an improv group. And I remember I wasn't ever afraid of making a fool of myself and getting myself into situations where I could potentially be in danger, of getting punched or something, right? So I had this kind of ballsiness in terms of being able to ask people awkward questions in the guise of a character. I couldn't do it, right? But in the guise of a character and supported by the infrastructure of the show, and I could go out there and say really, really outrageous things to people, and with a complete, blank face, like when I asked Rick Scott to pee in the cup,
Totally.
So it was that. So there was a couple of, so I guess it was an evolution, but finally it took about a year or so before I found my real footing, I feel like, at the Daily Show.
And you were dealing oftentimes with Middle Eastern politics, which have been on high boil, and certainly the reaction in the United States has been controversial, as you cite Islamophobia and those phenomenon. Were there any news stories that just felt off limits or off base, or did you feel like you could go anywhere?
I mean, I never dealt with a story that there was a couple of times where I felt like we may have thrown someone under the bus for comedic purposes that I didn't feel like really deserved it. And that was one of the things that you learned on the show, was to leave your conscience outside the door when you go into these interviews, because if you let too much of that get in there, you're not going to go for the comedic jugular, and so there was one interview I remember. There was a story about this app where kids can buy fishes, and it's like a kids app, and somebody's son or daughter had spent like $3,000 on this app just buying these fishes because the password for the Apple ID was already in there or whatever. So we went to the manufacturer of this app and we spoke to him about why they would, and we learned that it's not really up to them, it's up to Apple. There was a whole story in there, but what we did was we put that father on the phone with the guy, this guy who was basically just had this business and had made this app and running, and he was a really nice guy. But we put him on the phone with the dad, who just screamed at the guy for like 5 minutes and called him every curse word under the sun and said, "You, blah, 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 blah." I remember thinking, yeah, this is probably a little unfair to do. He didn't really deserve that,
Sure.
And you just apologize. I'm sorry, sorry that happened. We'll try to do our best. And it, so there were moments when you sort of felt like, okay, maybe we pushed it a little bit too far. But most of the time you felt like, this guy deserves it because he's
Well, speaking of that, this is sort of in the annals of the Daily Show, I think one of the most celebrated / notorious interviews you ever did, because you actually impacted the course of politics. And that was your interview with Don Yelton, the North Carolina Republican precinct chair. And I'm sure, because it is such a well-known piece, I'm asking you to tell it yet again. But can you? Because it really changed the course of politics.
Well, we went, it's actually apropos for today, because we went down there to investigate voter fraud, which there is very little evidence of, as we know. And Don Yelton was there. And this guy, every now and then there's a saying that we used to have, which is I don't know if I could swear on this thing, but like basically it's fucking the chicken. And it's basically, you want to get the guy or the woman who you're interviewing to say they fucked the chicken, because that's your story. Then when you get them to admit that, then you're off and running, And Don Yelton was just a great example of someone who just stepped right in it and didn't for some reason often when you talk to politicians, I hated interviewing politicians because it was always like they were just too coached and they were too would never answer the question. They were too slick and too well prepped at avoiding questions. And whereas Don Yelton seemed to have none of that. He just seemed to like say exactly what was on his mind. And he was a perfect example of like sort of the privilege of a guy who just believes that like what I'm saying is, he doesn't recognize the racism and the absurdity of what he was saying. And he just started admitting all of these things like, well, we're actually trying to disenfranchise, we said to him at one point, I said, you're trying to disenfranchise people of color. And he said, actually, no, we're actually trying to disenfranchise Democrats. And it was like, oh, wait a minute. I think you just let the horse out of the barn. Like, don't say that. You can say you're racist, but you can't say we're just disenfranchising Democrats. Like, we accept the racism part. But it was sort of one of those things where, like, this guy, and then when we let him go, and it was, you just let him talk. And my role in that was just to stay out of the way. And you recognize in that moment, like, oh, this guy, if I just prod him, he's going to drive the bus off the cliff, and just let him go. And we had so much material on him. The initial edit that we did of that piece did not have a lot of the stuff that ultimately, destroyed the guy and destroyed his career, because he said all the stuff about Obama and the racism and the, and the N-word and he did all that stuff. And we didn't put that in there because we thought it was too much. We thought it was ridiculous. Like, the guy is a clown. And so we sort of tried to keep it more streamlined and smarter in a way. And then John Stewart came in and saw the first cut, and he said, wow, this guy's character, this guy's wow. And then he looked at us as he was walking out of the room, and he just said an afterthought, and he said, by the way, do you have any more stuff with him? And I remember myself and Jenna, the producer, we looked at each other and we were like, do we have any more stuff with him? We have like another 20 minutes of footage of just him just going off at the mouth. And he said, yeah, I think just put as much of it as you can in there. Like, let's just roll to him and let him just go. And so we did, and we just put it all in there and just put it on a thing and just sort of edited out all the the really extraneous stuff, but then just kept it. And then and it was this remarkable sort of monologue that he did of like that, just people's jaw was, and then it buttoned it with me saying, we can hear you, which felt like the perfect button at the end of all that, But it was, and at the time I didn't realize that it would have any impact at all, because we never thought about that stuff, but the reality is that when it did, there was a moment where I remember I was visiting a friend in DC, and it was soon after that piece came out, and people were buying me drinks. Random strangers were buying me drinks in DC, because they were like, we can't believe that you were able to get that, and that it changed it actually helped change the law.
Because it led to his resignation, right?
Well, it led to his resignation because I think the Republican Party in North Carolina was like, dude, you can't say that. Like, we might say that to ourselves behind curtains. You can't go on national television and say this stuff. And I think they thought, this guy's a lunatic. Like, who's like, And so they fired him. He had to resign the next day, and he was upset about it. I remember he went on a radio show or something a long time later, and he was still upset about the fact that he had to resign because he felt like he was just telling the truth.
Wow.
And so he didn't understand. I don't think he ever
That's
quite got it.
unbelievable. Now, when you turn on the news today and you see Rudy Giuliani melting, and you see QAnon supporters talking about Democrats worshiping
Yeah.
Satan and eating babies, and I won't even mention our current president, but when you see politics reach a new kind of extremity, does that make you wish you were back in the game, or do you thank God that you're not?
In a weird way, what's going on right now, and especially with this administration, just feels like it's so crazy now and out there. And maybe, at some point you start going like, I don't know how to even make a joke out of this, because it's already it's a joke on a joke. Like, all you have to do now is just point. Just go, well, there it is. Look at that. That's banana. I mean, you can always make a joke. Obviously, there's always a way to do it. But it just feels like when things are so crazy and absurd, and there's no sense of. I mean, one of the things that we did on the Daily Show, I think, was call the bullshit, right? But when you call bullshit, you need someone who's trying to hide the bullshit, so you can call it out. You could, if the emperor has no clothes and he's willing to admit that he has no clothes, then there's no story. What do you do with it? Like, he's like, yep, that's right. We're, now it just feels like that. Like, it feels like nobody's even trying to hide it. They're not even trying to play the game that we can call them on and sort of, say, you're full of shit. You're not, because they know they are. And it's not even, they're not even pretending anymore. It's now just about say whatever you need to say. And it doesn't matter if it's true, whatever it is, just people will believe it. There's a certain sector of society that will just believe it. When Trump says something, there's a certain tens of millions of people in this country who are just going to believe that, and they're not going to care if he's lying or telling the truth. And so you can't, maybe I mean, I occasionally drop in and check out Trevor or the late night hosts or whatever, and see what they're doing. And look, kudos to them. But I think it's a harder job now. Was when at least there was a pretense of decorum, or at least of some kind of like business as usual. Now it's just going out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think, I mean, I'm talking to you in an interesting moment, because we're in the waning days of the Trump administration, and up ahead we see the Biden years coming. Do you think most pundits are elated and relieved, or do you think they're mourning the loss of a sort of walking stooge?
Well, I mean, look, it's no joke. I mean, it's no secret that Trump makes incredible television. I mean, he just does. And, I personally am like, as much as I am incredibly grateful that we have Biden, coming into office on January 20th, I have to say, Trump was the greatest reality show that we could ever, like, I did get up every day and go, what did the maniac in the White House do today? What did he say? What did he tweet? And it did sort of, and I think it sort of took up a certain amount of my day when I wasn't worried about things in my own life, and I could just sort of go, well, look at what crazy did today, and we won't have that in the same way. And honestly, I think we're healthier for it. But I think I think all of us probably feel like, yeah, there was a, it's that thing where you watch a reality show and then at the end when it's over, you go like, oh God, I feel nauseous, that I just sat and watched all of that for that whole period of time. Even though while it's going on, you're glued to it, like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? And it's just mind numbing stuff, and you sort of it's eating candy, and I don't think it's good for you. And I think That's why we need to get back to some kind of like where I mean, who knows where we are now? Maybe we'll never go back to exactly what it was before Trump, because also Trump has exposed a tremendous amount of fragility and frailty in our democratic system that I think other people will also, it's not Biden maybe, but now it's sort of like you can't put that back in the box again, like there's a way to exploit our system, and we're going to have somebody else who's going to come along at some point and try to exploit the system. It's now Trump has gone, it can be done. It can be done. You can just pass executive orders. You can pardon all sins, you can just do whatever you want, and because so much of what I realize is that our government is based on people just sort of doing the right thing and sort of adhering to the norms and the protocol of what is, and if somebody comes along and just goes, well, screw all that, I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want. And then you're like, okay, we don't really have anything in place other than like voting the person out, or, and thank God we did. But it does sort of, do we need to put some, guardrails on our democracy so somebody can't just get a hold of the bus and drive it off a cliff next time.
No, that's very well said. I want to touch back on something that you mentioned before, and that's your status as an immigrant, because I know you were born in Mumbai and schooled in England and then came to the United States. And I often think that sometimes it is those outsiders who to some degree, I feel this sometimes as a gay man, like are outside looking in, and that gives us a heightened sense of scrutiny. So I think in the arts in particular, we look to outsiders to tell us the boldest truths about ourselves. And do you feel that is true of you as an immigrant working in the arts in a sort of what has previously been a kind of white dominant culture? I mean, thankfully that's changing, but certainly it's something that you've had to confront.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an immigrant, as a person of color, as like you said, an outsider, I think when you are the outsider looking into the mainstream culture, you end up doing a lot more self-reflection and a self-analysis and sort of trying to figure out, how do I fit in? How do I, I was talking about the Daily Show earlier, like that sense of like, how do I bring my otherness and use that as my superpower in this situation, which if you are part of the mainstream culture, you never really have to think about, because there's a path already created for you, and so I think as an immigrant, as a person of color, like I said, I was personally forced to be more inventive and kind of figure out how I wanted to, because, when I started out, there weren't a lot of brown South Asian actors in the theater, in entertainment, and the stories were not being told. And when I wrote Sakina's Restaurant, which I did a production of at the New York Theater Workshop, before it went to the American Place, it was about me taking my outsider otherness and wanting to use that as a way of storytelling and telling that story, which, and also because nobody was giving me any parts, like no one was offering me anything. I would go to LA and pilot season, I would sit there and all my friends would get pilots, and they were like, because there were no roles, there were just absolutely no roles written for people who were not white or black, and there were less roles for black people, but there were, Asians and South Asians, there were like practically none, one maybe would come up every now and then, really stereotypical sort of thing or whatever. So I had to kind of go, okay, well, what do I do? How do I, if I'm going to be in this business, I'm going to survive in this business, I have to figure out what I can do, because the phone's not going to ring unless I do something. And that, I think, was an amazing way and then what that forced me to do was to think about, to sort of go inward and kind of figure out what the stories I wanted to tell. And then I still think I do that. And even when I was on The Daily Show years later, by virtue of the fact that I was an immigrant and that I was often able to sit on a fence between the inside and the outside, mm-hmm. and be able to talk from both vantage points simultaneously, which I don't think a lot of people, other than someone who is an immigrant or someone who's an immigrant, could do effectively. You know, I mean, sometimes John Oliver could do that, but he was British, so basically it was just another version of American anyway. But you know, and his whole thing came from a sense of superiority, whereas mine came from like my character, you know, which I never consciously thought of, but the character ended up being a guy who sort of can see both outside and inside and call the absurdity on both, you know, pox on both your houses kind of thing, you know? And so that, I think, benefited me in that way. Yeah,
that makes sense. I've got a couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. But I'm going to depart politics for a moment, and because I know you're a fellow theater geek, I'm going to ask you two, I guess you could say craft-related questions. But I have to blushingly admit, I did not see Sakina's Restaurant live, but I was able to watch it online. And
wow.
I would, and I so appreciated it. It's an astonishing piece, and your range in it. I mean, I could see how you could be cast in almost anything after the panoply of characters that you portray in that show. But I felt a real kinship to it because I felt like you and I were both operating out of the same tradition. When I wrote I Am My Own Wife, and when you wrote Sakina's Restaurant, we were both dealing with the conventions of the one-man show, which is a perilous journey to take. It's written with pitfalls, and yet I like to think that in Wife we found some fresh ways of approaching it, and I can say with certainty that you did in Sakina's Restaurant. What was the journey of creating that piece?
The journey was, you know, again, it goes back to necessity is the mother of invention, and I was a young actor in New York. I wasn't getting any auditions. I wasn't really getting any parts. I was waiting tables, and I thought, well, initially I thought, let me try my hand at stand-up, because I had a couple of friends who were doing stand-up, and I got up on stage and I started doing stand-up, and I felt like, okay, this is okay. I'm not super comfortable in this world, but what I started doing was writing characters. And then I realized, like, oh, these characters actually work better in a theater setting than in a stand-up setting, and actually frees me up, because I was familiar with the theater and my milieu is that, and I thought, oh, I don't have to try to get a joke every 3 seconds in the thing, and I can just sort of focus on the characters. And I like writing characters. You know, I as a writer, I've always struggled with the fact that I'm better at character than I am at story, you know, and so the characters are great. So I started working, and then I started studying with a gentleman named Win Handman.
Of course, legendary.
Who we all know, and who sadly passed away this year from COVID. But he took me into his acting class, and I went to him because I had a couple of these characters that I'd written, and I thought, this guy worked with Bogosian, he worked with Leguizamo, and those are the two guys I knew at the time. Like, they had more successful one-person shows, you know, and I thought, that's what I want to do. And I also thought, you know, as you sort of saw, that if I can write something for myself, maybe it will help casting directors and people and agents and all the people who want to sort of see, you know, oh, well, how do we cast this guy? Like, they can say, how incredibly talented I am, you know, and how I should be getting more roles and all that. So I wrote it from that place. But when I got into Win's, so I wrote these characters. I auditioned for Win. He said, come on in and we'll work on your stuff. And Win actually helped me go deeper with those characters, because initially I felt like they were a little sketchy. They were a little, you know, like a character in a sketch comedy. And then he started helping me find the depth in it, and also how to structure the monologue so that it had innate tension, I remember there's one character I do in the play, in Sakina's restaurant. It was a father, and he's on the phone, and he's having this very like emotional conversation with his daughter about, his life and her life, and what will happen, and how, and it's really about like the separate. I gave my real father voice to the things that he didn't have the ability to say, but felt like he wanted to say. And I was sort of writing, but it was the way I had written it. It was kind of relentless. It was just like him just talking. And I remember Wynn saying, what if there was a phone call at the beginning, and he said, what if the phone just keeps ringing throughout this piece, and this man who's trying to have this incredibly emotional conversation with his daughter has to keep on returning to the phone to run his business and put on that business side, another. And so we did this exercise. I remember where he said, I want you to just do the monologue. And I just started doing it. And he goes, and then he would say, the phone's ringing. The phone is ringing. And I go, oh God. And I go, and be like, yeah, remember, you're the businessman now. You got to keep it together. You can't. So then, hello, blah, blah, blah. He's like, okay. And then hang up. He goes, okay, now go back to your daughter. Now, where were you? What were you saying? And I go back and the phone is ringing. The phone's ringing. And he would do that. And through that process, I started to realize, oh, this is how you write this. And it was a remarkable thing. And I wish I could write everything this way, because it's so great to be able to get up in front of a group of people and try stuff out like that and just fail and then try again and do it a different way. It's hard to write a one-man show, especially a one-man show. I don't know if you found this, but I found it hard to write a one-man show because I was also performing it, but just in my room, it really helped me to get up and do it. And that has always helped me because you start to find things. And what was great about Wynn's class at that time was that he did that for me and helped me discover it on its feet, And so, and then I just started writing more characters. And then, like I said earlier, I actually ended up doing it as part of a solo festival of the New York Theater Workshop. I'd done it at the West Bank Downstairs Theater for like a 4-night run. Then New York Theater Workshop said, hey, listen, we have an extra slot in this solo festival. Do you want to do your show for one night? And it was me and Dale Olander Smith and a bunch of other people. And I did it. Wynn came to that show at New York Theater Workshop after he had been working with me on it for a number of, like a year, more than a year. And he said, I think you're finally ready now. And he said, let's do it at the American Place. And
that's thrilling.
And we ended up doing it there. Yeah.
That adjustment he gave you, that infernal device of the telephone, it's like suddenly that's when you see a monologue become an actual tour de force. It's like that's the adjustment that makes it brilliant and just puts it over the top. Yeah. A final question that's sort of related. Given the high wire act you performed on The Daily Show, where you would walk into potentially volatile situations and lob comic grenades, and the insanity of that, and the improvisatory nature of that, and the danger of that. Now, when you go into a rehearsal situation and you've got, say, your teleplay for your series Evil, or you've got, a play by Ayad Akhtar where the lines are all prescribed for you, do you ever feel like that is comparatively a kind of shackle? Do you miss the sort of wildness of the freedom of the Daily Show years?
Well, that's an interesting question. Look, you just mentioned two projects, one Evil and the other one Ayad's play, both of them written by, Robert King and Michelle King, tremendous writers, and Ayad, obviously, a tremendous writer. And so in those situations, when you're supported by great writing, you don't feel that sense of like, I just want to get free of these shackles of these words, and when you have great storytelling and great writing, yes, there are instances where sometimes the writing isn't quite that good. And there is a part of me that goes, I think I can do better. I think I can improvise something that's better than this. I can play with something. But I like, at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller. And so I like telling stories. And Sometimes that story is told by just jumping out of an airplane and not knowing where you're going, and other times it is more laid out for you, and your job is slightly different. So I like the skill set that I have to use in those two different environments. I like going back, just in the same way that I like going between comedy and drama. You know, I like challenging myself to do different things at different times, because I get bored, I think, when I'm doing one thing or one way of doing it all the time. So even when I was on The Daily Show, John would let me go off and do other projects sometimes, so that I could get that out of my system as well. You know, I did Ayad's play, Disgraced, while I was on The Daily Show. And it was great because I'd get to do a remarkable play at night, and then during the day, play a completely different wackadoodle character. And that was just a lot of fun. And also had enter that journalist sort of headspace as well. Like, so it was a totally different. So I like being able to go back and forth and stuff like that.
Well, it's to our gain, because we get to see you do it all. And this has been extraordinary, Aasif.
Thank you.
It's been a really enriching conversation. It's been illuminating for me. It's been fantastic to get to know you. Now, of course, you have me fantasizing about the day I might be privileged enough to find myself in a rehearsal hall with you.
It'd be my honor.
No, it just this was a real treat. And again, I said this before we started, but I do want to let you to know that that from everyone at the workshop, this is an astonishing gesture of support for us during these COVID times. Yeah. And to get to spend a little time with you is an invaluable gift. And so thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This has been such a treat to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you.